For decades, the world of personal computing has been dominated by one familiar environment: Windows. It's the operating system most people grew up with, the one installed on the majority of PCs, the one used in schools, offices, and homes. Because of that familiarity, many people assume switching away from it would be difficult, confusing, or even impossible. Linux, on the other hand, has always carried a different reputation. Some see it as a playground for programmers, a system that requires command-line knowledge, endless troubleshooting, and patience. But how much of that reputation is actually true today? We decided to find out in a way that would push people completely out of their comfort zone. We took a group of long-time Windows users and forced them to use Linux for 30 days. No switching back, no dual booting to Windows when things got tough, and no remote desktop back into their old systems. For an entire month, Linux would be their only operating system. What happened next was far more interesting, and sometimes far more uncomfortable, than anyone expected. Before the challenge even began, the reactions from the participants already revealed a lot about how people view operating systems. Most of them had used Windows for over 10 years. For them, the Start menu, the taskbar, File Explorer, and common applications like Microsoft Office were second nature. When we told them they would be switching to Linux for 30 days, their first response was confusion mixed with skepticism. Some asked if Linux even had a graphical interface. Others wondered if basic things like watching YouTube, installing software, or connecting Bluetooth headphones would even work. A few assumed they would spend most of the time typing mysterious commands into a terminal window just to open files. Clearly, Linux's reputation had reached them long before the challenge started. To make the experiment fair, we didn't choose a complicated distribution designed only for advanced users. Instead, we installed a beginner-friendly Linux distribution with a polished desktop environment. The goal wasn't to torture the participants with technical complexity, but to see what would happen when everyday users relied entirely on Linux for their daily computing tasks. Each participant received a freshly installed Linux laptop configured with common software, including a web browser, Office Suite, media player, and messaging apps. We gave them a short 30-minute introduction explaining basic concepts like the software store, the settings menu, and file management. After that, they were on their own. Day one was filled with curiosity and cautious exploration. The first thing many participants noticed was how different the desktop environment looked compared to Windows. Some were surprised to see a familiar layout with a taskbar and application launcher, while others were confused about where to find certain settings. One participant spent several minutes searching for the equivalent of the Windows control panel before realizing that Linux organizes settings differently. Another kept trying to right-click the desktop, expecting the same context menu options found in Windows, only to discover that things worked slightly differently. But despite those small moments of confusion, the participants quickly discovered something surprising. For basic tasks, like browsing the internet, watching videos, sending emails, and chatting online, Linux felt almost identical to Windows. Opening a browser and visiting websites like YouTube, Gmail, and social media worked exactly as expected. In fact, one participant commented that if you spend most of your time in a browser anyway, the operating system almost doesn't matter anymore. However, the first uncomfortable moment appeared when participants tried installing new software. Windows users are used to downloading an installer file from a website, double-clicking it, and following a series of steps until the program installs. Linux approaches software differently. Most applications are installed through a centralized software store or package manager. At first, this concept confused some participants. One of them searched the internet for a program, downloaded a file, and tried to run it the Windows way, only to realize that Linux prefers installing apps directly from its repository. After learning this new method, however, many participants admitted that it actually felt simpler. Instead of visiting multiple websites and worrying about fake download buttons or bundled software, they could install most applications with a single click. By the end of the first week, the participants were starting to adapt. Tasks that seemed strange at the beginning were slowly becoming routine. They learned how to manage files using the Linux File Manager, how to install programs from the Software Center, and how to customize their desktops with themes and widgets. In fact, customization became one of the biggest surprises of the experiment. Windows users are used to limited customization options without installing third-party tools. On Linux, however, the participants discovered that they could change almost every aspect of their desktop environment. From the look of the taskbar to the behavior of windows and animations, the system felt far more flexible than they expected. But not everything went smoothly. The second week introduced one of the biggest challenges: software compatibility. While Linux has excellent alternatives for many applications, some Windows-specific programs simply don't exist on Linux. This became particularly noticeable for participants who relied on specialized software. One user who regularly used a specific Windows-only application for work had to search for alternatives. Another discovered that a game they enjoyed playing on Windows didn't run natively on Linux. These moments were frustrating because they forced participants to rethink the tools they relied on daily. Interestingly, this challenge also led to unexpected discoveries. When participants searched for Linux alternatives, they often found open-source programs that were just as capable, and sometimes even better, than the ones they used before. For example, instead of Microsoft Office, they tried a free Office suite that could open and edit most document formats. Instead of proprietary media players, they found powerful open-source options that handled almost every video format without extra downloads. Slowly, the participants began to realize that Linux wasn't lacking software, it just had a different ecosystem. Another uncomfortable moment came when something went wrong. Windows users are used to searching for solutions that involve familiar menus and settings. Linux troubleshooting sometimes introduces concepts like logs, permissions, or terminal commands. When one participant's Bluetooth headphones refused to connect, they initially panicked. But after searching online and following a few simple commands, the issue was fixed in minutes. Surprisingly, that experience changed how they viewed the terminal. Instead of seeing it as a scary hacker tool, they began to understand it as a powerful way to quickly solve problems. Performance was another area where Linux made a strong impression. Several participants noticed that their systems felt faster and more responsive compared to Windows. Boot times were shorter, applications opened quickly, and the overall system seemed smoother. One participant who was using an older laptop commented that Linux made the device feel new again. Without the background services and heavy processes commonly associated with Windows, the operating system used fewer system resources. Security also became a topic of discussion during the experiment. Many participants were used to installing antivirus software on Windows to protect their systems. On Linux, however, none of them needed additional antivirus tools during the 30 days. The operating system's design, combined with software repositories and strong permission systems, made malware far less common. This realization made some participants question how much effort they had previously spent worrying about viruses and security warnings on Windows. By the third week, something unexpected began to happen. Participants stopped comparing everything to Windows. At the beginning of the challenge, almost every task triggered a comment like "this is different from Windows," or "this would be easier on Windows." But after several weeks of daily use, Linux started to feel normal. The new interface, the software store, and even the occasional terminal command became part of their routine. However, not everyone fully embraced the change. One participant admitted that while Linux worked well for most tasks, they still missed certain familiar features of Windows. Another struggled with gaming compatibility. Despite improvements in Linux gaming support, these frustrations highlighted an important truth. Switching operating systems isn't just about learning new tools, it's about changing habits built over many years. As the final week approached, we asked participants to reflect on their experiences. The answers were surprisingly balanced. Some participants said they were seriously considering staying on Linux, even after the challenge ended. They appreciated the speed, customization, and freedom that the operating system offered. Others said they would probably return to Windows, but with a completely new perspective on Linux. One participant summarized the experience perfectly. At the beginning of the experiment, they expected Linux to feel like a technical maze full of complicated commands. Instead, they discovered a modern operating system capable of handling most everyday tasks with ease. The biggest barrier wasn't the software itself, it was the mindset of being used to something else. The most uncomfortable part of the experiment wasn't dealing with Linux. It was breaking years of habits formed by using Windows. Simple things like where to click, how to install programs, or which shortcuts to use felt strange at first. But once those habits changed, the system started to make sense. In the end, the 30-day challenge revealed something important about technology and human behavior. People often resist change not because the alternative is worse, but because it's unfamiliar. Windows users didn't struggle with Linux because it was unusable. They struggled because it required learning a slightly different way of doing things. When the experiment finally ended, we gave participants the option to return to Windows or continue using Linux. The results were surprising. Several participants immediately asked if they could keep their Linux installations. Others decided to dual boot both systems so they could use whichever one suited their needs. Only a few switched back to Windows without hesitation. What this experiment ultimately showed is that the gap between Windows and Linux isn't as large as many people think. Modern Linux distributions have evolved into user-friendly, polished systems capable of replacing Windows for many everyday users. The biggest challenge isn't technical limitations, it's simply the willingness to try something different, and that might be the most uncomfortable result of all. For years, many people dismissed Linux as too complicated or impractical for normal users, but after 30 days of real-world use, those assumptions started to fall apart. The truth is that Linux isn't just for programmers anymore. It's a powerful, flexible operating system that anyone can learn with a little patience. So if you've spent your entire life using Windows and always assumed Linux was too difficult, the real question might not be whether Linux is ready for you. The question might be whether you're ready to leave your comfort zone and try something new. Because as our participants discovered during those 30 days, the hardest part of switching operating systems isn't the software, it's the change.